Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that literally affects almost every single individual and business in the US, but honestly, it's still super misunderstood. I'm talking about the US tax system. Think of it like a giant, incredibly complex board game. The US economy is the board, the stakes are very, very real, and knowing the actual rulebook, well, that's your absolute only defense. If you don't understand how the rules are written, who actually enforces them, and where you stand in the whole hierarchy of authority, you're basically playing blindfolded. So let's change that right now.
Here's a quick look at where we're headed today. First, the sheer scale of the IRS. 2, we'll meet the IRS divisions. 3, the tax law hierarchy. 4, primary versus secondary authority. And finally, number 5, taking it to court.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the scale of the IRS. To really get this, we have to look at the staggering magnitude of the agency acting as our referee. We hear about the IRS all the time, right? But the true scale of their operations is something you kind of have to quantify to believe. Get this, the Internal Revenue Service processes around 260 million tax returns annually. And through that massive, monumental effort, they collect over $4 trillion a year. Just let that sink in for a second. $4 trillion. Operating strictly as a massive collection and enforcement arm under the Treasury Department, the IRS isn't some independent agency. It's a highly structured administrative machine built to process just an absolute ocean of financial data every single year.
Now here is a crucial takeaway. The IRS administers the law, it doesn't write it. This is a super common misconception. It's actually Congress that writes the Internal Revenue Code, or the IRC, and the Treasury Department issues regulations to interpret it. The IRS, they just act as the referee enforcing those rules on the field. They don't just invent tax rates out of thin air. They simply apply what Congress has mandated.
Moving on to Section 2, meet the IRS divisions.
So to properly understand how this huge game is officiated, we really need to meet the different types of referees. The IRS doesn't just lump everyone into one giant bucket. No, they map taxpayers into clean, highly specialized categories so they know exactly where you fit. For instance, if you're an individual wage earner, you're dealing with wage and investment, or W&I. They typically handle standard correspondence audits. But if you run a small business or you're a sole proprietor, you fall under SB/SE, where examinations tend to be broader and more in person. Then you've got the heavy hitters, LB&I, for massive C corporations with over $10 million in assets, handling really complex international stuff like transfer pricing. And finally, TE/GE oversees nonprofits and pension plans.
But wait, there's one more division, and you have to be extremely cautious here. I'm talking about the Criminal Investigation Division, or CI. If you're an advisory professional or a taxpayer and you see CI get involved, the entire landscape changes. These are special agents with real, actual law enforcement authority. They investigate tax fraud and financial crimes. This means if fraud is suspected, it has to be escalated immediately. You do not try to manage this casually. This is the literal law enforcement arm of the tax code.
All right, let's turn to Section 3, the tax law hierarchy.
Let's open up the actual rulebook. Just like any legal system, not all rules are created equal. There's a strict hierarchy here. At the absolute top, Level 1, we have the U.S. Constitution, specifically the 16th Amendment, which authorizes the income tax. Level 2 is the Internal Revenue Code, written by Congress. Then, Level 3, Treasury regulations. Moving further down to Level 4, we see revenue rulings and procedures. But take a look at the very bottom. Level 7 is where you find IRS publications, website FAQs, and notices. It's incredibly important to recognize the immense sprawling distance between the binding law sitting at the very top and the informal guidance hanging out down at the bottom.
Let's zoom in on Level 3 for a second, Treasury regulations, because knowing the difference between final, proposed, and temporary regulations is absolutely critical for figuring out what actually has the force of law right now. Final regulations are legally binding, period. Proposed regulations, well, they're published for public comment. They definitely signal the intended direction, but they aren't binding yet. And then you have temporary regulations, which are a kind of unique hybrid. They're immediately effective and treated as binding, but they automatically expire after 3 years.
That brings us to Section 4, primary versus secondary authority.
Understanding that whole hierarchy naturally leads us to probably the most important strategy in the game, knowing the crucial difference between primary and secondary authority. This right here is where tax strategies either stand strong or completely fall apart under scrutiny. A tax position is really only as strong as its foundation. Primary authorities, like the IRC, final Treasury regulations, and court decisions, they act like a brick wall. They are legally binding. Both taxpayers and the courts have to follow them. Secondary authorities, on the other hand, like an IRS FAQ or publication, they're more like a house of cards. They're persuasive, sure, but they are not legally binding. An FAQ can literally be withdrawn by the IRS at any time, totally without notice, and it absolutely cannot save you if it conflicts with primary law.
Now let's talk about Level 5 authority for a quick second. Here's a fascinating insider tactic. Large players often use private letter rulings, or PLRs, to get guaranteed certainty from the IRS before doing a major transaction. Basically, a taxpayer writes to the IRS detailing a very specific situation, and the IRS writes back telling them exactly how they'll rule. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. That PLR is legally binding only for the specific taxpayer who requested it. Other taxpayers can read it to maybe gain some insight or get a hint into IRS thinking, but there's no way they can cite it as binding precedent for themselves.
And finally, Section 5, taking it to court.
So what happens when you and the IRS completely disagree? When administrative resolution just fails, you need to challenge a referee's call and take your dispute to the judicial system. Well, you actually have 3 specific judicial paths, and the strategic differences between them are huge. First up, the U.S. Tax Court. Here, you get specialized tax judges, and crucially, you don't even have to pay the disputed tax before the trial. If you don't have the cash on hand, this is often your only route. Second, the U.S. District Court. For this one, you do have to pay the tax first and then sue for a refund, but this is literally the only option where you can request a jury trial. And third, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Again, payment is required up front, and there's no jury here either.
But the game doesn't stop at the trial level. You have to be incredibly careful here, because decisions can be appealed to the circuit courts of appeals. And amazingly, different circuit courts might rule entirely differently on the exact same tax law. Think about that. That means a winning tax strategy for a business in one state could completely fail for a business operating in another state simply because they sit in different judicial circuits. In the U.S. tax system, geography matters tremendously.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to ask yourself a critical question about your own compliance. If the IRS challenged your tax return today, is your defense built on the solid bedrock of legally binding primary law? Or are you resting on a fragile, non-binding FAQ you found on a website somewhere? Remember, in the complex game of U.S. taxes, a position is only as strong as the authority supporting it. Knowing the hierarchy of the rulebook isn't just trivia, it is everything. Thanks for watching, and keep building that solid foundation.